Good evening. I'm Patricia Banskite, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Green Spaces, Empire's Traces, a Victorian History of Houseplant Culture. People love indoor plants, going back to the ancients, but by the 19th century, interest in houseplants exploded. During the Victorian era, these spaces became showcases for elaborate collections of ornamental plants, many of which were sourced from Africa, Asia, and other regions tied to British colonialism. Tonight's program will explore the Victorian history of houseplants. This program is offered in conjunction with our exhibition at the Lloyd Library, Welcome to My Jungle. As we were curating this exhibition, we looked to experts on the subject, and time and again we came across the scholarship of Lindsay Wells. Lindsay is no stranger to us. She was one of our 2022 Curtis Gates Lloyd Fellows. Lindsay Wells is an art historian and scholar of 19th century Britain with a focus on histories of empires, the environment, and plants. She earned her PhD in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has held recent postdoctoral fellowships at the Getty Research Institute and UCLA. Her essays on botany, art, and horticulture have appeared in Victorian Studies, Victorian Literature and Culture, and Literature Compass. It is my great pleasure to welcome Lindsay Wells. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. And as always, if you can't see or hear me properly at any point, just feel free to jump in and I will fix that right up. But anyway, moving along, good evening, everyone. As Patricia just said, my name is Lindsay Wells, and I'm so delighted to be joining you virtually this evening with the Lloyd Library and Museum, where, as Patricia mentioned, I was fortunate enough to hold a visiting research fellowship a couple of summers ago. And you'll notice that a lot of the material I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is currently housed at the Lloyd, and quite a bit of it is in the current exhibition there on houseplants. So I wanted to start by again expressing my gratitude for the opportunity to work with this really amazing collection. I'm also excited to be here because short and sweet, houseplants are simply some of my favorite things to talk about. While I'm an art historian by training, a lot of my scholarship focuses on the history of gardening in 19th century Britain and indoor gardening in particular. And after writing an entire dissertation on this topic, I still remain fascinated by what houseplants can teach us about the wider world. I think one reason I became interested in this specific type of horticulture is because how some of the themes that many of you will probably, if you have a chance to go to the Lloyd's exhibition on houseplants, you'll notice that several of the themes addressed in this exhibition, such as climate change, industrialization, and the rise of a global economy, were once all central to Victorian discussions of indoor gardening. And to give you a little preview of what I'm going to be looking at, we might start with this following quote from a horticulturalist in 1888, who wrote that the majority of large cities in Great Britain are so congested, the smoke, injurious fumes from factories, and fogs are so abundant that all vegetation has a severe struggle for existence. As coal consumption increased throughout the 19th century, so did the need to innovate new forms of gardening that could protect plants from human-caused pollution. Advances in glasshouse technology, along with the emergence of parlor and window horticulture, subsequently allowed the Victorians to create miniature gardens within their homes, which they filled with plants from Africa, Asia, the Americas, and other regions of British colonial activity. In his 1873 article, The Migration of Useful Plants, Victorian garden writer Henry Evershed noted that the travelers of the last century brought to England innumerable shrubs from India, North America, and the Mediterranean coast. And recent horticultural collectors have added to our shrubberies and flower borders from the uplands of China and Japan, from California and the Cape, and have filled our hothouses with beautiful foliage. While all modes of horticulture shaped Victorian Britain's imperialist outlook on the natural world, indoor gardening forged some of the period's strongest conceptual links between plants and empire. And I think we can really see that going on here in the Evershed quote I just shared. From orchids and azaleas to parlor palms and cacti, many of the most popular houseplants from this time hailed from far overseas, contributing directly to how foreign nature was perceived and interpreted by people in Britain. Intimate in scale and portable by design, houseplants not only brought the ecological consequences of modernity into the heart of the Victorian home, but also chronicled the rapid spread of the British Empire. So my talk this evening is going to explore how indoor gardening grafted together this promise of environmental renewal with the politics of colonial expansion, all the while reinforcing ideas about class and gender in Victorian society. Of course, people all around the world have been growing plants indoors since ancient times, with some of the earliest glasshouses, or orangeries as they were called in Europe, dating back to at least the 1600s. This practice, however, grew exponentially in Britain during the first half of the 19th century, a time when the rise of the conservatory, terrarium, window box, and parlor garden redefined the place of plants in everyday British life. As American horticulturalist Henry T. Williams observed in 1875, in England, nearly everyone has either its greenhouse, its window garden, or its greenhouse, and scarcely any family of intelligence but knows something of the culture and propagation of indoor plants. By the time Williams made this observation, houseplant horticulture had long since eclipsed the sprawling landscape gardens of the 18th century, evolving into a beloved pastime across every social class in Britain. From aristocratic conservatories full of tropical flowers to working class windowsills arranged with potted geraniums, indoor gardens were touted as one of the most accessible forms of horticulture in 19th century Britain, available to anyone with a flower pot at their disposal. Everyone cannot possess the luxury of a garden in the widest sense of the word, wrote plant collector Frederick Burbage in 1874, but all may grow plants and flowers in and around their dwellings. Following the rise of steam-powered boilers in the 18th century, coupled with the repeal of Britain's tax on sheet glass in the 19th, conservatories and other glasshouses became more and more common at this time, dictating in the process which plants became fashionable home decorations. Of all the improvements in modern luxury, none is more delightful than the connection of living rooms with a greenhouse, wrote landscape designer Humphrey Repton in 1816, his remarks anticipating how such structures would continue to inspire awe for decades to come. For example, as Victorian tastemaker Mary Eliza Hawes recalled in 1885, I remember when oxeye daisies and daffodils were regarded with disgust as nasty things. I was bidden not to pluck them as a child. That was because they did not grow in a hothouse. Even now, many persons prefer a camellia to a garden rose, simply for that reason. As we can see here, indoor gardens were widely regarded as sites of identity formation and conspicuous consumption, with the glasshouse imparting an air of both cosmopolitan refinement and technological modernity to the cultivation of ornamental plants. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining even a modest conservatory also rendered it an emblem of leisured affluence, or what Victorian science writer Agnes Catlow referred to in her handbook on greenhouse botany as an indispensable addition to a garden of any pretensions. Once the privilege of the wealthy, horticulture did become a luxury for the millions in the 19th century in Britain, thanks to these advances in indoor gardening. Though, as we can see from some of the quotes I've just shared, it remained a luxury embedded within larger hierarchies of class within Victorian society. Like other forms of horticulture, indoor gardening was also promoted as an edifying leisure activity in the 19th century, a so-called rational recreation that was thought, at least in theory, to promote and reinforce such virtues as patience, diligence, and industry in the British public. In 1856, for example, the horticultural journalist Shirley Hibbard argued that caring for houseplants would inspire people to be students of the outdoor world, whence many noble inspirations and humanizing teachings and devotional impulses are drawn. Because of its close proximity to the home, indoor gardening was additionally promoted as a respectable pursuit for Victorian women. Long associated with idealized definitions of femininity, gardens of all sorts were deemed appropriately domestic spaces for Victorian women to occupy, in part because the care of plants was often compared to the practice of housekeeping or raising children at this time. The mother of little children will never be in doubt how to treat her plants, for they want the exact same kind of treatment as her children do, argued botanical illustrator Elizabeth Twining in 1865, echoing Hibbard's claim a decade earlier that no wife, especially if she have children growing up around her, should suffer the disgrace of an unused greenhouse. Both gendered and classist in tone, such arguments were pervasive in Victorian guides about houseplant horticulture. But at the same time, indoor gardening licensed British women to claim the more masculine title of gardener for themselves, all the while engaging in physical labor that fell beyond the scope of traditional femininity, such as shoveling, weeding, and even sweating. Far from merely occupying the conservatory or parlor, women played a key role in distinguishing indoor gardening as its own unique branch of horticulture in Britain through their work as journalists, garden designers, and botanical illustrators. Victorian garden writer Elizabeth Mayling, for example, devoted several of her books to the subject of houseplants, in which she encouraged women to claim ownership over the horticultural spaces they created in their homes. To quote Mayling's 1863 handbook, The Indoor Gardener, "There is something extremely charming to the mind of a window gardener in being able to point to some especial plant and to declare she grew it." In 1851, Louisa Johnson similarly ventured in her anonymously published Every Lady's Guide to Her Own Greenhouse, Hothouse, and Conservatory that if ladies in general were to consider their greenhouses, their stoves, and their conservatories their own, they would derive much more pleasure from the progress of their plants. By claiming agency over and pride in their houseplants, Victorian women carved out a distinct sphere of horticultural influence, shaping not only the perception of indoor gardening at large, but also public opinion about acceptable forms of female labor. As the frontispiece to Mayling's 1862 manual, Indoor Plants, reminds us, houseplants also became popular because they were highly adaptable to different living situations. Horticultural journals of the period contain countless pictures of these diminutive gardens, many of which blur the lines between the natural and the artificial. Be it a multi-tiered plant stand overflowing with orchids, or a windowsill conservatory complete with Barbie-sized fish pond, These intricate arrangements transform the household objects around them into living sculptures of flowers and foliage. And once urbanization made access to outdoor green space harder to come by in Victorian Britain, people began to turn to these devices with great enthusiasm. By 1851, over half of Britain's once rural population now lived, for the first time in history, within towns and cities, prompting garden writers to promote houseplant horticulture as a refreshing tonic to the ills of urban life. For a busy city toiler, wrote one horticulturalist in 1883, nothing is so restful, refreshing, interesting, and beneficial after the labors of the day as looking after a few plants in pots or boxes. Decades earlier, the anonymous author of a handbook called The Parlor Garden had likewise argued that potted plants draw away the mind from those life-corroding cares that the exigencies of modern life inflict upon all city dwellers, and relieve the eye and the brain at the same time, so long doomed to gaze at white ledgers, glaring red walls, and dingy edifices. Replace white ledgers with Excel spreadsheets and glaring red walls with smartphones, and I think the enduring relevance of this claim about plants and wellness becomes immediately apparent. As such comments also remind us, 19th century garden writers were keenly aware of the benefits houseplants imparted on both physical and mental health. Although scientists did not fully understand the mechanics behind photosynthesis until the late 1800s, advances in biology and chemistry in the previous century had confirmed that plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while also releasing oxygen into the air we breathe. Victorian garden writers were well aware of this symbiotic exchange between humans and plants, and many celebrated it as a wholesome benefit to the home gardener. In her 1885 manual on orchids, for example, American writer Harriet Stewart Minor declared that the indoor culture of plants is intimately connected with the sanitary condition of our dwellings, adding that through their agency, the atmosphere is kept in healthy equilibrium. Indoor gardening brought people and plants into close contact with one another, and thus underscored how they mutually responded to the environments they shared. It is therefore not surprising that garden writers would also go on to promote houseplants at this time in relation to topics like urban pollution. Throughout the 19th century, British garden writers repeatedly stressed the ecological dangers of burning fossil fuels, identifying the consumption of coal in particular as posing a direct threat to vegetal life. As one text warned in 1824, the florists in the immediate vicinity of the metropolis certainly labor under great disadvantage from the atmosphere being almost always charged with clouds of unwholesome smoke, ascending from such an infinity of chimneys. Such cautionary asides about urban air pollution appeared routinely on the pages of the Victorian horticultural press, which helped Britons conceptualize their increasingly fraught relationship to the natural world. Although people could not always see the toxic particles produced by burning coal, they could watch their houseplants wither from exposure to the same air that they themselves were breathing. They could also witness how placing their plants beneath glass reduced the impact of this harmful atmosphere. The chief advantages of London conservatories, explained one observer in 1862, is that they keep out smoke. Indoor gardening, as we can see, operated as a sort of crucible for environmental awareness in 19th century Britain, even as visual representations of them tended to obscure industrial pollution almost entirely from view. This is certainly the case in the illustrations from an article on window gardening published in 1877 by John Mollison, who later reprinted the images you see up here on the screen in a longer handbook on the topic. As Mollison writes in this article, "Everyone delights in possessing a flower, from the poor in the back lanes of the city, who treasure their one little plant, struggling for existence in the poisoned atmosphere, to the wealthy with their gardens and plant houses stocked with all the rarest plants and flowers that money can procure." Here we once again see how indoor gardening sparked larger conversations in the horticultural press about the tolls of industrial modernity. At the same time, though, Mollinson's reference to the rarest plants and flowers that money can procure reminds us of the economic stakes embedded in Victorian houseplant horticulture, which relied on the global networks of imperialism to both expand and flourish. Motivated by the search for valuable natural resources, Britain's acquisition of the plants found in many indoor gardens at this time, from Japanese azaleas and Mexican fuchsias to African pelargoniums and Chinese camellias, went hand in hand with the growth of its empire. According to some estimates, the number of plant species cultivated in England alone rose from about 200 in the 16th century to 18,000 by the start of the 19th, an increase due in no small part to the spread of British political influence around the world. In his 1847 article, The History of English Gardening, writer Archibald Hamilton even went so far as to identify this influx of plants as the defining characteristic of indoor gardening in Britain. "Of stove plants," he writes, "we now cultivate 1,800 species and varieties. Of greenhouse plants, about 3,000, and of hardy perennial flowers, nearly 3,000. Of biennial and annual flowers together, about 800. During the first 16 years of this century, on average, 156 plants were annually introduced." Gardening books and periodicals advanced a broad range of claims about houseplants during this period, but the one point they consistently agreed upon was that the consumption of exotic flora was a British privilege. Pick up any Victorian gardening book or journal, and 10 to 1, you are going to find in a defense of British imperialism, along with the racial and social hierarchies it upheld, sitting alongside what we might today consider genuinely progressive arguments on, say, the ecological tolls of modern manufacturing, or the need for public green spaces to combat urban sprawl, or fossil fuel consumption as a threat to both human and vegetal life. As the Scottish landscape designer and founder of Britain's modern horticultural press, John Claudius Loudon, wrote in 1838, "The benefits experienced by breathing air unconfined by close streets of houses and uncontaminated by the smoke of chimneys are greatly increased by the possession of a garden." A statement he made just a decade after declaring in the inaugural issue of his journal, The Gardener's Magazine, that the introduction of a new hardy tree or shrub, or the acclimating of one hitherto supposed too tender for the open air, may be considered as among the most patriotic of gardening efforts. Admittedly, this second quote from Loudon offers us a rather tacit endorsement of British colonial plant hunting, at least in comparison to later garden writers who describe the practice in much blunter terms. For example, as Hibbert argued in 1858, Britain must have dahlias from the west and roses from the east. Siberia must present her pansies, Africa pelargoniums and heaths, China chrysanthemums, India her rhododendrons. Every tropical land its stores of bright colors and wonderful forms. Or, to give another example, as garden writer Henry Hill put it 2 decades before Hibberd wrote this, the introduction of a useful or an ornamental plant into our island is justly considered as one of the most important services a person can render his country. It bestows on us a share of the blessings of other climates and affords us a portion of the smiles of a more genial sun. By referring to plants as the blessings and smiles of foreign lands rather than profitable natural resources, Hill, much like Hibberd after him, obscures the economic and political motives that informed Britain's global search for valuable flora throughout the 19th century. Culled from the tropics to the poles and marketed across every social class, houseplants formed a living index of Britain's political and economic influence around the world, with every corner of the empire occupying its allotted plot in the Victorian glasshouse or window box. To conclude, 19th century Britain's fascination with houseplants reflects a complex intersection of environmental thought, imperial ambition, and social identity formation. Indoor gardening offered the Victorians a refuge from the modern industrial landscape that they had created, yet it was fundamentally linked with the extractive practices of building an empire. These competing narratives of houseplants as symbols of imperial entitlement and as catalysts for ecological change invite us to critically reconsider the ways in which histories of empire and the environment were intertwined with one another in the 19th century, and how horticulture can act as a springboard for conversations that are still just as relevant today as they were in the 19th century. And with that, I would love to say thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll turn it over back to Patricia.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. That was just fascinating. Yeah, I love the way that you were able to show how those two perspectives were, in a way, from today's perspective, sort of fighting with each other a little bit. I was wondering about a couple of things when, we know that the ancients had, indoor plants. And, we think about things like the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire and that sort of thing. I know this is a little bit out of the Victorian time frame, but do you see similar things at play when you're looking at the ancients? Is it also very much tied to their concept of empires, or maybe not colonialism in the way that we know it today, and at the same time, espousing the health benefits?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And you're, completely right. I think if we had another hour, I would love to go into sort of the pre-Victorian history of indoor gardening in more depth. And I know the exhibition does that a little bit as well. But what's really interesting is many Victorian gardening books will often start with some sort of condensed sort of Reader's Digest history of indoor gardening as they understood it at the time. And that included, talking about the Romans using very thin sheets of stone to create their own sort of glass houses and everything. So they were definitely aware that this wasn't necessarily new, but they did like to really harp on the sort of the technological modernity of it all, that all these improvements to things like steam-powered boilers and the architectural construction of greenhouses really let them, take this to a new level. And it's definitely during the 19th century that we see it being practiced a lot more democratically. Certainly in the 18th century, you needed a lot of money to maintain something like a conservatory. And we see more accessible forms like, the window box conservatory coming in the 19th, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, also, I think it's also really fascinating how the cultivation of plants and their global circulation, it's a part of a story of every empire throughout history. The Romans brought many different plants, including several types of evergreens, to Britain during that occupation in ancient times. The Mughal Empire in India, the Mughal emperors were great patrons of horticulture and brought tons of plants from places like China into India and facilitated those introductions. And the Victorians were very aware of and honestly extremely jealous of the horticultural traditions, specifically in China and Japan, which obviously through colonial travel and trade, they were encountering more frequently in the 19th century, and talked about quite a lot about, the nursery gardens in China being so advanced and sort of far outpacing anything that was in Britain at the time. So I think it's interesting how plants, you can go almost any time in history and all around the world, and you're going to find them, becoming into play and a part of those stories. So I think that's a great question to sort of bring it all together.
So I want to mention a few comments and questions from our audience. First of
Sure.
all, we have from Frederick that he appreciated the excellent manner of public speaking, that they were enjoying so much. It was so clear and
Good.
easy to follow.
I'm
And
glad. I always worry I go too fast, so I try to, take my time. So I appreciate that.
and they also like the nice touch of the green type on there. Um,
Good. I'm
there's a
glad.
shout
Thank you.
There's a shout out to the Lloyd's wonderful collection.
Mhm.
And then also a question. You mentioned that this is from Holly. You mentioned that indoor gardening opened doors for women to pursue other forms of feminine labor and pursuits. Did it open doors to women in scientific pursuits, i.e., botany, ecology, and the
Mhm.
environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And also, one of the reasons that I became so interested in gardening in this context is, the gender politics of it all, I find quite interesting. And so the short answer is yes, absolutely. Especially in the 19th century, a lot of scientific disciplines, as we think of them today, weren't necessarily as discrete and formed the way we think of, say, plant science. If you were to go study that at university today. In the 19th century, horticulture was really regarded as a science akin to botany, and you needed to know one in order to practice the other. And there were many women who made professional careers out of not only publishing horticultural books like Elizabeth Mayling, who I shared some of her work, but also wrote for scientific periodicals on botany, published their own handbooks and guides on botany, their own, like we might think of them as textbooks today, worked as botanical illustrators for scientists. So the two practices were very, overlapping and intertwined. And again, if we had more time, I would love to go a little bit more into that relationship, because there's a lot of really interesting, quotes you find in 19th century gardening journals about, you need to have a grasp of natural history, of botanical taxonomy, of plant science to make sense of any of this. And even further, things like soil chemistry and, understanding the weather and geology. So absolutely, this, I think it was an avenue where women could really make professional careers and support themselves in a society that otherwise wanted to slot them into very limited roles. And it was definitely a gateway into a more scientific career as well.
One of the things that I noticed and was reminded of things like if we think about, American slavery and the way some cultural things, some, lavish lifestyles and all of that were made possible by that. The sort of, again, you mentioned the, tension between the idea of indoor plants being healthy, but, the context. Another thing that I couldn't I mean, every day I'm struck by this, but as many of the examples that you showed us, the engravings and so on, that they were just so beautiful, and so sort of that irony or tension between something that's so beautiful, but everything is not beautiful,
Exactly. An idea I've become really interested in, been doing some new research on lately, is how things like art and beauty, as the 19th century progressed, almost started being put forth by these garden writers as a justification for imperial expansion or bioprospecting abroad. So you will often see people, especially when they talk about the botanists and naturalists who were, going out and collecting plants on behalf of the British Empire, both legally and not so legally around the world. You often see them being talked about in 19th century gardening journals, not as these agents of empire per se, but rather as these sort of curators of the garden, that their only concern is to share beautiful plants with others. So the horticultural press, they really go to great lengths to try to paint these plant collectors as, altruistic and artistic, and therefore by implication, apolitical. And of course it wasn't. They were being employed by government institutions like the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. They might be collecting some garden flowers, but also searching for, say, valuable plantation crops at the same time. So you really can't talk about one without the other. And same goes with this sort of ecological, environmental aspect. I know in talking to your colleague Erin the other day, I know one of the items in your exhibition is the handbook on terrariums or Wardian cases that was published by its inventor, Nathaniel Ward. And if I had more time, I would have loved to have talked about this in my talk, but I think the terrarium is so interesting because the person who invented it, he wrote a handbook about it in the 1840s, and about half of the handbook is about, all the good stuff we like to think about houseplants. They clean the air, they're good for your mental health if you live in a city. We need to think about how pollution is threatening plants in our modern age, all that stuff. And then the other half of the book is just sort of this celebration of, oh, and these cases are also really useful for taking plants out of different countries and bringing them to Britain. And they were used to do things like smuggle tea plants out of China into, at the time, British controlled India and establish tea plantations in areas like Assam and around Darjeeling. So it's this fascinating history. And that book in particular, it's like, from paragraph to paragraph, you're getting sort of what I like to think of as like ethical whiplash in terms of like I think to the modern reader, we find the environmental side so compelling and then the imperialist side so abhorrent. And so I'm very fascinated by how intertwined that is and how consistent this sort of dualism is across the 19th century. We can find it in the earliest decades of the 19th century and all the way into the early 20th century. So I think that's a really great observation.
So when you talk about that dualism,
Mhm.
um, if you dig deep, did you ever encounter any books where somebody, you have to dig, but sort of subtly is making a different point of view or subtly calling out that not at all is as great as it seems? Or do you see pretty across the board everybody in step?
Yeah, well, something does spring to mind, but it's maybe not necessarily the confrontation we want it to be. So there was a small but vocal group of garden writers throughout the 19th century who really weren't into the exotic plants, who were trying to promote, cultivating, wildflowers, native British flora, working with local plants, which again, I think that resonates maybe to a lot of us today in terms of sustainable gardening and all of that good stuff. However, I try not to give too much lenience to the Victorians because if you read between the lines, there's some weird sort of what I like to think of as botanical gatekeeping going on, as in like some garden writers are worried about, contamination from abroad, which of course there's a lot of baggage related to race and empire and ideologies around that in the 19th century. But then there's others who you read these articles about, oh, you should only be growing wild British flowers. And you can kind of get a sense of there's a lot of anxiety and almost jealousy about the horticultural traditions of other cultures around the world, and also just about the greater biodiversity there is in other parts of the world
Yeah.
compared to Britain. So this need to, talk up British flora when faced with, the overwhelming diversity of plants in places of, say, like South Africa or the Indian subcontinent or Australia. So yeah, there are some, what we might like to think of as protests against this sort of like imperialist search for plants, but I think we still have to read those carefully because, they often will still have their own prejudices.
Yeah, it sounds like they have a nativist slant. If
Yeah,
you,
that's a
yeah.
perfect word to describe it. Absolutely.
Well, Sarah wants to know what were some of the horticultural innovations shown at the Great Exhibition of 1851?
Yeah. Oh, again, I'm sad I cut a little paragraph out of my talk last minute, but I was going to talk about there were, especially right in mid-century, all these sort of what I think of as big horticultural spectacles in Britain. And the Great Exhibition is a great example. So, as many people are probably aware, this was when a giant glass house known as the Crystal Palace was built by a famous gardener named Joseph Paxton in the middle of Hyde Park in London. And the house housed a giant World's Fair, one of the biggest, to take place in the 19th century. And his designs for this space were directly influenced by his work as a glasshouse architect for some very prominent British nobles at the time. But what's really interesting is, so we did have terrariums or Wardian cases were displayed at the Crystal Palace. So there was some, showing off of the latest horticultural tech, so to speak. But one thing I found, which was really interesting, is if you look at pictures of the Crystal Palace, and I think I had one photograph of the interior in my talk. It was full of different plants, all sorts of different potted plants from around the world. And these were all sourced from major nursery gardens in and around London. And I've come across a couple articles naming, which nurseries contributed the azaleas, which ones contributed the palm trees, et cetera. So it really was also, I think, a bit of a, public advertisement for these big nursery institutions, which are really the precursor to our modern day garden centers. So absolutely, there was both, horticultural, implements and tech on display at the Great Exhibition, but then also plants themselves were sort of there in the background as well.
Rebecca wants to know, when did medical considerations of houseplants come in?
That's a great question. So actually pretty early if we want to think in very broad terms. So I have looked at a couple of gardening manuals from the 18th century. There's one by, I think he was a nursery gardener named Thomas Fairchild from the first half of the 18th century that did talk about, plants being, important, especially if you live in smoky cities. So in very broad strokes, we do get sort of that awareness early on that like, oh, if you don't have access to plants, you might want to bring some into your home to make up for that. But definitely in the 19th century, pretty early on, it really grows in tandem with the British scientific community's understanding of photosynthesis and how that works. So as the 19th century goes on, you find lots of different articles about plants being good for the health of the air within your home. And they will often cite scientific research about what we would today call photosynthesis, that, it takes away carbon dioxide or carbonic acid, as it was known during that time, and releases oxygen, which is good for people. And they will often then say people do the reverse in how our respiratory works. So there's, from pretty early on, Florence Nightingale, the great nursing pioneer, she also talked a little bit about plants being good for your health because of this, exchange of air we have with them. So yeah, it's a part of the conversation all throughout. And by the end of the 19th century, you get, more scientific figures writing entire treatises and handbooks on the topic as well.
Well, what about also actually not just good for your overall health, but medicinally? So, for example, I think one
Hmm.
of the few plants I have in my kitchen is aloe.
Right.
So I burn myself, rip
Yeah.
off a leaf and put the aloe on. Were the Victorians using some of their plants in a sort of more medical way, or was it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, that kind of bridges into also the popularity of what was called at the time kitchen gardens. So gardens that were specifically grown either for their culinary or their medicinal uses. We might think of the Chelsea Physic Garden in London and Physic gardens, going back all the way to the medieval period as being something. And certainly from medieval times on, often in those earlier periods, if you did bring any plants into your home, it was precisely for that reason, because they had either a culinary or a medicinal benefit. So maybe growing rosemary or lavender in a pot in your kitchen would be important. So absolutely, it's part of the discourse from pretty early on.
Well, Lindsay, I want to thank you so much for placing Victorian gardens in a wider context and helping us to understand a lot of the underpinnings behind them. I'd like to thank everybody that is here for attending tonight's lecture. Programs like these, as well as the fellowship program, are supported by Lloyd members. And if you're a member, thank you. And if you're not, consider joining. You can find more information about us at lloydlibrary.org and also on our Instagram page, Lloyd Library Official. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. This was a delight to be here this evening, and I'm so happy to get to share this work with you and especially the Lloyd's collections.
Lindsay, I almost let you off the hook, but there
I
is
see.
a
I think we have
question that
one late
yeah.
question.
So I want to give you that. And that's when bringing plants into the home, were the lower classes able to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really interesting. So I shared a few quotes about, gardening being promoted as, people in the 19th century like to talk about indoor gardening as being this democratic enterprise because, even if you just have one flower pot, you can still participate in it. I definitely think they were being a little bit idealistic. And as we saw with some of our quotes, there's a lot of sort of classist rhetoric in garden writing of what's appropriate for, someone, upper class versus working class, how ambitious should they be in their horticulture? But what is interesting is that many plants that we might, that were grown and prized as these sort of exotic rarities, things like pelargoniums from South Africa or fuchsias from South America, were extremely popular, what were discussed at the time as working class plants. So we definitely see people all across different social echelons participating both in the environmental and the imperial sides of houseplant horticulture. So that was a great question because it kind of brought the two sides back together.
And just a huge array of people loving your presentation, thanking you, beautiful presentation. So again, thank you all for coming. And Lindsay, thank you. And all have a good night.
Great. Thanks again for the invitation.
Bye-bye.